Also happening right now, President Donald Trump is on his way back to Washington after a multi-stop trip through Asia. He ended his visit with a highly anticipated face-to-face with China's President Xi Jinping. The last time the two leaders met in the same room was back in 2019, but the president is calling this most recent sit-down a truly great meeting with many agreements made. So here is what we know so far. The president says the overall tariff rate on imports of Chinese goods will go down from 57 to 47%. That decision was made after President Xi promised to stop the flow of chemicals that make fentanyl from reaching the U.S. And that's not all. Trump signaled that the two leaders settled issues over China's rare earth mineral exports. He also says the two discussed computer chips and the purchase of U.S. soybeans. After the two-hour meeting, CBS News chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes pressed the president on the details and when the agreement would be put in writing.
What are the major stumbling blocks that are left now to work through, and how soon do you think you could sign a trade deal with China?
Well, I think pretty soon. We have not too many major stumbling blocks. We have a deal. Now, every year we'll renegotiate the deal. But I think the deal will go on for a long time, long beyond the year. We'll negotiate at the end of a year.
So let's start there with CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman. Willie, what progress was actually made here? The president had a lot to say, but what do we know about the progress?
Hey there, Mugo. Well, certainly a bit of progress made in terms of the trade relationship between the U.S. and China, as you mentioned perfectly there. That 100% additional tariff rate no longer on the table. And the president talking about this meeting, one that he called truly great, with President Xi of China, and said that there's much respect between both nations. A couple of agreements or deals that were struck here. That overall tariff rate down from 57% to 47%, in large part because China agreed to work on stopping the flow of illicit fentanyl. On top of that, you have China purchasing billions of metric tons of soybeans. And now, of course, it's an open question in terms of if that will be enough to appease U.S. farmers, who certainly have taken a hit in terms of China moving its purchases of soybeans to other countries, notably in South America. You also have an agreement between the U.S. and China for China not to restrict the critical minerals that the U.S. and other nations need to be able to power everyday equipment that we use, our phones, electric vehicles, different electronic products. You certainly need those critical minerals, and China essentially holds a monopoly on the refined products that critical minerals provide for everyday life. So the U.S. moving forward in terms of that part there. But the president also touching on something that I find interesting as well, that this agreement will be worked on year by year, appearing to be a case-by-case basis in terms of the negotiating of this moving forward. No final deal, no signature yet, but we anticipate that would happen in the coming days. And one last thing I also want to mention as well is TikTok. Certainly millions of Americans are interested in this part of the conversation. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, signaled earlier this week that a deal would be finalized when the two men sat down together on Thursday. That appears that it didn't happen, but still the Treasury Secretary signaling, as well as China signaling, that the U.S. and China are going to work together to come up with the final agreement of TikTok. Remember, the president kicked the can down the road, so to speak, in that executive action that he signed that would delay the banning of TikTok for an agreement to be worked out. And now the Chinese signaling that they are going to work with the Americans. Of course, that would be a private transaction, but work with American investors on a TikTok deal, Mugo.
And Willie, what can you tell us about China looking to purchase more high-tech computer chips from the U.S.?
Yeah, that's right. Specifically NVIDIA chips that are powerful chips that power artificial intelligence. The U.S. had instituted certain restrictions on these high-end chips, and China put in place their own restrictions and told their companies to get their hands on their own chips that are produced domestically. So the CEO of NVIDIA mentioning that there's a 0% market share, but perhaps that could change in China. Take a listen to what the president said earlier.
We did discuss chips, and they're going to be talking to NVIDIA and others about taking chips. Look, we make great chips. NVIDIA is the leader. And I'll be speaking to Jensen from NVIDIA, but they're going to be discussing that with NVIDIA to see whether or not they can do. I said that's really between you and NVIDIA, but we're sort of the arbitrator or the referee.
And the president mentioning Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, there in his remarks aboard Air Force One. Only time will tell if NVIDIA is able to increase their market share, but certainly there's a lot of concern about those chips and whether or not the Chinese should have access to the most advanced chips that power artificial intelligence, Mugo.
All right, Willie James Inman at the White House for us today. Thank you so much. And as we said, President Trump lowered the overall tariff rate on imports of Chinese goods from 57% to 47%. And Chinese President Xi Jinping promised to work to slow shipments of fentanyl ingredients into the U.S. President Trump says China will also resume buying soybeans from the U.S. and the conflict over Chinese restrictions on rare earth mineral exports was, quote, settled. So I want to bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, seems like progress was made with China on trade. So what economic benefits could come out of all of this?
So there are a couple that I want to highlight. One, you mentioned the tariff rate going down by 10 percentage points. That's significant for businesses, for consumers that purchase things from China, right? We want to see it go that way versus it going that 100% extra that was taken off the table. So it's almost like, yes, it's going down, but you're also avoiding with this framework deal something worse. So that would be one area. Willie mentioned the rare earth resources. That's another big one. So many companies, from technology to defense, pretty much everything that has to do with your phone, electronics, etc., they use these rare earth resources. So ensuring that they have access to that it's not going to need an export license for a product coming from China that uses rare earth resources to come to the U.S., that would be a big win and save these companies a lot of headache when China really controls the majority of those global resources. And then finally, the soybean factor of it all, the agriculture piece, that's going to be really important from farmers, though I will note that our Iowa correspondent, Lana Zach, she was able to obtain some details that the metric ton amount that soybean farmers would be selling, that China would purchase from them for 2025, it doesn't really get them up to the levels that they saw last year. So it's really about going forward. Yeah. So that's going to be an area, what are the commitments for 2026, 2027?
Okay. And Kelly, let's talk about this because the Federal Reserve chose to cut interest rates by 0.25%. And that means rates are now at their lowest in nearly 3 years. What stood out to you about Fed Chair Jerome Powell's speech yesterday?
So it seems again that the Fed is prioritizing the labor market weakness. Fed Chair Powell, he said, look, inflation, it's still an issue, but we are really concerned about that. The layoffs that we are seeing from a number of companies over the past few weeks, the fact that it's taking people longer to find a job when they are out of work, that tightness. And then ultimately, are we going to get a cut in December? That was a foregone conclusion at the last meeting. This time around, Fed Chair Powell said it is not a foregone conclusion. The markets really didn't like that yesterday. They're back up today. But definitely that lack of certainty going forward when it comes to the interest rate path was the biggest news of the day.
Okay. Kelly O'Grady, thank you so much for joining us.